Imagine a world where the streets of Queens, New York, pulsate with danger and opportunity. A realm where the line between criminal enterprise and cultural revolution blurs, and one man's ambition reshapes an entire generation. Welcome to the story of Kenneth Supreme McGriff and the infamous Supreme Team. In the concrete jungle of South Jamaica, where dreams are forged in the crucible of poverty and violence, a young Kenneth McGriff emerges as a force to be reckoned with. As the crack cocaine epidemic sweeps through the boroughs, Supreme's ruthless ambition finds its fullest expression, giving birth to one of the most notorious criminal empires in New York City's history. But this is more than just a tale of street-level drug dealing. It's a saga that intertwines the gritty realities of urban crime with the nascent hip-hop scene, forever altering the landscape of both. From the bullet-riddled streets to the glittering heights of the music industry, Supreme's influence reaches far and wide, leaving an indelible mark on the culture of an era. Prepare to delve into a world where power is absolute, loyalty is fleeting, and the price of success is measured in blood. This is the story of the Supreme Team, a chronicle of ambition, violence, and the complex legacy of a man who dared to rewrite the rules of the game. Chapter 1. The Rise of Supreme, A Queen's Tale. In the concrete jungle of South Jamaica, Queens, a young Kenneth McGriff was forged into a force to be reckoned with. Born into a neighborhood ravaged by poverty and crime, he would eventually rise to become one of the most notorious figures in New York City's underworld, a man known simply as Supreme. As the 1980s dawned, the streets of Queens fell into the grip of a deadly epidemic. Crack cocaine swept through the boroughs, fueling a frenzied drug trade that promised untold riches for those bold and ruthless enough to seize the opportunity. Against this backdrop, Supreme's ambition and cunning would find their fullest expression. Supreme's early life was a far cry from the opulent heights he would one day reach. He grew up in the Baisley Park housing projects, where the cacophony of urban life formed the soundtrack to his formative years. The rumble of drug dealers' cars, the crack of gunfire, and the wail of police sirens were the white noise that permeated his world. Yet, even amidst the chaos, Supreme displayed a keen intellect and a relentless drive that set him apart from his peers. Supreme was always different, recalled Gerald Prince Miller, Supreme's nephew and eventual successor. He had this way about him, this hunger for power, that you couldn't help but notice. Even as a kid, you could tell he was destined for something big, even if it wasn't always going to be good. That something big came to fruition in the mid-1980s as the crack epidemic reached its fever pitch. Supreme, now a young man in his 20s, had already established himself as a formidable presence on the streets. Drawing on his connections within the 5% Nation, a black nationalist movement with roots in the Nation of Islam, Supreme began to assemble what would become known as the Supreme Team, a ruthlessly efficient drug trafficking operation that would come to dominate the streets of Queens. The Supreme Team's rise to power was swift and merciless. Leveraging their connections and the sheer volume of their drug distribution network, the organization soon grossed up to $200,000 a day in profits. Supreme's lieutenants, including his nephew Prince, oversaw a vast network of dealers and enforcers who ensured the smooth flow of product and the protection of their turf. "We had it all locked down," Prince would later recall. "The projects, the streets, the clubs. If you wanted to move weight in Queens, you had to go through us." Supreme made sure of that. Supreme's iron grip on the drug trade was matched only by the violence that accompanied it. The Supreme Team was responsible for a string of brutal murders, eliminating rivals and potential threats with ruthless efficiency. Their reputation for savagery spread far and wide, striking fear into the hearts of those who dared to challenge their dominance. Yet, even as Supreme's criminal empire flourished, a cultural revolution was taking root in the very same streets that birthed his reign. The nascent hip-hop scene in Queens was beginning to gain national attention, with artists like Run DMC and LL Cool J emerging as the voices of a generation. Supreme, ever the opportunist, recognized the potential power of this burgeoning industry and began to forge connections with the movers and shakers of the music world. Supreme was always about making money, and he saw the potential in hip-hop early on, said one former associate who requested anonymity. He started financing shows, parties, all kinds of events. He wanted to be a part of it, to have his hands in everything that was happening in the neighborhood. Supreme's influence soon extended beyond the drug trade and into the realm of entertainment. He cultivated relationships with influential figures like Russell Simmons, the co-founder of Def Jam Recordings, and leveraged his criminal connections to provide security and financial backing for up-and-coming artists. In the eyes of many, Supreme had become a veritable kingpin, wielding power in both the streets and the burgeoning world of hip-hop. Supreme was like a modern-day Al Capone, said a former law enforcement officer who investigated the Supreme Team. He had his fingers in so many pies, it was almost impossible to keep track of him. The streets, the clubs, the music industry, he was a master at blurring the lines between it all. As the 1980s drew to a close, Supreme's grip on Queens seemed unbreakable. The Supreme Team had become a well-oiled machine, with Supreme at the helm, steering it towards ever greater heights of power and profitability. But cracks in his empire were beginning to show, and the reckoning that would ultimately bring about his downfall was fast approaching. In the final days of the decade, the streets of Queens were about to bear witness to the culmination of Supreme's rise, a rise that would indelibly shape the course of hip-hop history and the criminal underworld for years to come. Chapter 2: Empire of the Streets. As the 1980s progressed, the Supreme Team's grip on the drug trade in South Jamaica, Queens, tightened into an iron fist. What began as a small-time operation had morphed into a sprawling criminal empire with Supreme at the helm. The team's daily earnings were staggering, reaching up to $200,000 at the height of their operations. Supreme surrounded himself with a loyal crew, each member playing a crucial role in the organization's success. At the top was Supreme himself, a charismatic and ruthless leader who commanded respect and fear in equal measure. Beneath him, his nephew Gerald Prince Miller served as the team's second-in-command, overseeing day-to-day operations with an iron grip. The Supreme Team's reach extended far beyond street-level drug dealing. They established an intricate distribution network with suppliers, enforcers, and lookouts strategically placed throughout the neighborhood. Their operations ran with military precision, Supreme demanding absolute loyalty and swift punishment for any perceived transgressions. One of the team's most distinctive trademarks was their fleet of bulletproof Mercedes-Benz sedans, a symbol of their power and wealth. These heavily armored vehicles were the team's primary mode of transportation, allowing them to move through the streets with impunity, shielded from rival gangs and law enforcement alike. Supreme's connections to the 5% Nation, a black Muslim offshoot, further bolstered the Supreme Team's influence. The group's ideology, which emphasized the inherent divinity of black people, provided a spiritual foundation for Supreme's criminal enterprise. Team members were required to adhere to the 5% Nation's teachings, including a strict code of conduct and a belief in the group's self-proclaimed role as the enlightened minority. This blend of religious fervor, military-like discipline, and sheer financial might made the Supreme Team a formidable force. Their operations weren't limited to the drug trade. They also used their resources to finance and promote various music events, further blurring the lines between the Underworld and Queens' burgeoning hip-hop scene. As the crack cocaine epidemic ravaged South Jamaica, the Supreme Team capitalized on the growing demand, becoming one of the area's largest distributors. Their ability to source high-quality product and maintain a reliable supply chain allowed them to dominate the local market, squeezing out smaller players and cementing their status as the undisputed kings of the drug trade. The team's ruthless tactics, however, came at a cost. Numerous murders and acts of violence were attributed to the Supreme Team as they eliminated rivals and silenced threats to their operations. South Jamaica became a war zone, with gunfire and bloodshed becoming all too common. Despite the violence and chaos surrounding them, the Supreme Team continued to thrive, amassing wealth and power at an unprecedented rate. Supreme himself lived a life of luxury, indulging in the trappings of his criminal success. He surrounded himself with beautiful women, exotic cars, and the latest high-end fashion, flaunting his wealth and status to all who crossed his path. Yet, even as the Supreme Team's empire expanded, cracks began to emerge in its foundation. Tensions within the organization, fueled by jealousy and power-hungry ambitions, threatened to tear the team apart from the inside. Supreme's iron grip on the operation was challenged by his own crew members, who sought to carve out their own territories and increase their share of the profits. As the 1980s drew to a close, the Supreme Team's reign over South Jamaica was at its peak, a testament to the team's ruthless efficiency and Supreme's unwavering leadership. But the seeds of their downfall had already been sown, as internal fissures widened and external threats loomed on the horizon. Chapter 3. Beats and Battles. As crack cocaine ravaged South Jamaica, Queens, a cultural revolution blossomed just blocks away. The same streets that birthed the Supreme Team's drug empire also gave rise to a musical movement that would captivate the world: hip-hop. Supreme's influence extended far beyond the drug trade. As his criminal empire flourished, he leveraged his wealth and connections to shape Queens' burgeoning hip-hop scene. The Supreme Team's money and muscle became indispensable to aspiring artists, producers, and promoters, blurring the lines between the underworld and entertainment industry. Supreme's first foray into music came in the early 1980s when he began financing local block parties and concerts. These events drew hundreds of young people from the projects, providing a platform for a new breed of MCs and DJs. Supreme's involvement ensured the Supreme Team's presence even at these seemingly innocuous gatherings. Supreme was always there, lurking in the background, recalled Daryl DMC McDaniels of Run DMC. You could feel his influence even if you didn't see him directly. He had his hands in everything happening in the neighborhood. Supreme's connections reached the upper echelons of the nascent hip-hop industry. He forged relationships with influential figures like Russell Simmons, co-founder of Def Jam Recordings, and LL Cool J, one of the label's first superstars. These alliances provided Supreme a veneer of legitimacy, allowing him to move freely in the music world while maintaining his grip on the drug trade. Supreme had this way of making you feel like you needed him, said Simmons, recalling his interactions with the crime boss. He'd offer to help promote your event or get you access to the streets. And of course, there was always the understanding that he'd expect something in return. This symbiotic relationship between Supreme and the hip-hop community had consequences. As the Supreme team's criminal activities escalated, the violence and fear permeating Queens streets seeped into the music. Lyrics, once celebrating urban life's vibrancy, now reflected the harsh realities of project life, with MCs rapping about drug deals, gang wars, and constant threats of retaliation. The music was a reflection of what was happening on the ground, said LL Cool J. You couldn't separate the two. Supreme and his crew were part of the fabric of our community, for better or worse. The Supreme team's influence extended to the era's fashion and style. Their signature look, bulletproof Mercedes-Benz sedans, designer suits, and ostentatious jewelry, became a visual shorthand for power and success in the eyes of aspiring rappers and their fans. We all wanted to be like Supreme and his guys, admitted Jam Master Jay, Run DMC's DJ. The way they dressed, the cars they drove, the way they carried themselves, it was like they were living out the dream we all had. As Supreme's reputation grew, so did the reverence with which the hip-hop community treated him. Artists and promoters sought his approval and backing, knowing his endorsement could make or break careers. Supreme, in turn, leveraged this influence to further his criminal agenda, using his connections to launder money, transport drugs, and even silence potential rivals. The blurring of lines between crime and culture peaked in the mid-1980s, as Supreme's involvement with the Supreme team intersected with the rise of Run DMC and LL Cool J. The Hollis-based group, known for their gritty, street-level anthems, became closely associated with Supreme and his crew, often performing at events financed by the drug kingpin. It was a strange dynamic, reflected Daryl McDaniels. We were making music that spoke to the realities of life in the projects, and Supreme was a big part of that. But at the same time, we knew he was involved in some really messed up stuff. It was a constant balancing act. The tension came to a head in 1986 when the Supreme team was implicated in the murder of E-Money Bags, a rival drug dealer. The killing, which occurred just days after a Supreme-backed Run DMC concert, sent shockwaves through the hip-hop community and threatened to sever ties between the music scene and the criminal underworld. It was a wake-up call for a lot of us, said LL Cool J. We realized we were getting too close to the fire, and the consequences could be devastating. Some of us tried to distance ourselves, but it was too late. Supreme had his hooks in deep. As crack continued to ravage Queens, Supreme's influence only grew stronger. He became a larger-than-life figure, symbolizing both the allure and dangers of the criminal lifestyle. Artists and fans alike were drawn to the power and wealth he commanded, even as they grappled with the moral implications of his actions. Supreme was like a modern-day Gatsby, said Irv Gotti, future co-founder of Murder Inc. Records. He had this magnetic pull, this aura of untouchability. You couldn't help but be drawn to him, even if you knew deep down that he was bad news. The intertwining of Supreme's criminal empire and Queen's burgeoning hip-hop scene would have lasting consequences for both the music industry and the community. As the narrative unfolds, Supreme's rise and fall becomes inextricably linked to the evolution of a cultural revolution that would captivate the world. Chapter 4: The Fall and the Fade. For over a decade, the streets of South Jamaica, Queens, had been Kenneth Supreme McGriff's fiefdom. His criminal organization, the Supreme Team, had become an unstoppable force, dominating the lucrative crack cocaine trade and amassing unimaginable wealth. But the empire Supreme had built was about to crumble. As the 1990s dawned, winds of change swept through Queens. The crack epidemic that had fueled Supreme's rise began to wane, and the once abundant profits started to dry up. The drug trade grew more competitive and volatile, with new players hungrily eyeing their slice of the pie. Amid this shifting landscape, Supreme faced his greatest challenge yet: maintaining his iron grip on power. Accustomed to the lavish lifestyle afforded by his criminal enterprises, the thought of losing it all was inconceivable. Determined to preserve his empire, Supreme doubled down, resorting to ever more ruthless tactics to eliminate rivals and keep his organization intact. But the escalating violence and instability took their toll on the Supreme Team. Infighting and betrayals became rampant as members jostled for position and fought over dwindling profits. Supreme's once unassailable rule began to unravel, exposing cracks in the organization's foundation. It was during this tumultuous period that Supreme's nephew, Gerald Prince Miller, emerged as a key player within the Supreme Team. With Supreme's incarceration looming, Prince stepped up to fill the void, assuming a more prominent role in the day-to-day operations of the criminal enterprise. Prince was a savvy and ambitious young man who keenly understood the shifting dynamics on the streets. Recognizing that the old ways of doing business were no longer viable, he began implementing new strategies to adapt to the changing landscape. Under his leadership, the Supreme Team sought to diversify, branching out into other illicit activities beyond the drug trade. However, Prince's ascension was far from smooth. The infighting and power struggles within the Supreme Team intensified as long-standing members resisted change and vied for their own piece of the shrinking pie. The violence that had once been a tool of control now threatened to tear the organization apart from within. As the Supreme Team's grip on Queens loosened, Supreme faced a harsh new reality. In 1991, he was arrested and sentenced to 7 years in federal prison for racketeering and drug trafficking charges. His incarceration marked a turning point, not just for Supreme himself, but for the entire criminal empire he had painstakingly built. Behind bars, Supreme was forced to confront the changes that had occurred in his absence. The crack epidemic was waning, and the Supreme Team's dominance was no longer assured. Prince and the rest of the organization had been forced to adapt, and Supreme's eventual return would be met with a host of new challenges. As Supreme contemplated his future, he knew the streets he had once ruled with an iron fist were no longer his to command. The world had moved on, and he would need to chart a new course if he hoped to maintain his influence and power. The once mighty Supreme Team now found itself in a state of flux, its future uncertain. The cracks that had appeared during Supreme's incarceration had only widened, and the organization stood at a crossroads. The question loomed: could Supreme reclaim his throne, or would his empire crumble under the weight of its own contradictions? Chapter 4 of the Supreme Team explores this pivotal moment when the criminal enterprise Supreme had built began to unravel. It examines the changing dynamics of the drug trade, Prince's rise as a new power broker, and the impact of Supreme's incarceration on the organization he had so carefully constructed. As the narrative unfolds, readers are left to ponder the fragility of power and the consequences of the criminal lifestyle, setting the stage for the final act in Kenneth Supreme McGriff's saga. Chapter 5: Rebirth Through Rhythm. Queens had transformed dramatically since Kenneth Supreme McGriff's first prison stint. The crack cocaine epidemic that fueled his criminal empire had waned, reshaping the borough's landscape. But Supreme wasn't one to be deterred by shifting tides. As he emerged from behind bars, he set his sights on a new path to power: the music industry. Supreme's connections had always extended beyond the drug trade. During his criminal heyday, he'd forged alliances with some of hip-hop's biggest names, financing events and leveraging his influence to carve out a space in the cultural landscape. Now, with his options in the drug game diminished, he saw an opportunity to reinvent himself and reclaim his position of power. The linchpin of Supreme's new venture would be his partnership with Irv Gotti, co-founder of Murder Inc. Records. Gotti, a fellow Queens native, had been making waves in the music industry, signing artists like Ja Rule and collaborating with Jay-Z and DMX. Supreme recognized the potential in aligning himself with Gotti and the burgeoning Murder Inc. empire. Supreme saw the writing on the wall, recalled a former associate speaking anonymously. The drug game wasn't as lucrative as it once was, and he knew he needed to diversify. Linking up with Irv was his ticket to staying relevant and maintaining influence, but this time in the music world. The Supreme Gotti partnership was a marriage of convenience, but it also highlighted the blurred lines between the criminal underworld and the entertainment industry. Gotti, aware of Supreme's reputation and connections, saw the value in having the former drug kingpin as a silent partner. Supreme, in turn, viewed the music business as a means to launder his ill-gotten gains and expand his reach. Irv knew what he was getting into, the former associate said. Supreme had the money and the connections, and Irv had the industry know-how. It was a perfect match, at least on paper. As Murder Inc. gained traction, Supreme's involvement became more pronounced. He provided financial backing for the label, investing in studio time, promotion, and artist development. In return, Supreme's name and influence became intricately woven into the fabric of the label's success. Supreme was the puppet master, revealed a former Murder Inc.'s employee, also requesting anonymity. He had his hands in everything, from business deals to creative direction. Irv may have been the public face, but Supreme was calling the shots. The partnership wasn't without challenges. The music industry, with its complex web of contracts, royalties, and legal requirements, was a far cry from the violent and unforgiving world of the drug trade. Supreme found himself navigating unfamiliar territory, relying on Gotti's expertise to maneuver through the business intricacies. Supreme was a street guy, through and through, the former employee explained. He was used to getting things done his way by any means necessary. But in the music industry, you can't just strong-arm your way to the top. It took some adjusting for him. Despite the learning curve, Supreme's involvement with Murder Inc. allowed him to maintain a high profile and continue exerting influence. He became a fixture at industry events, rubbing elbows with hip-hop's elite. Artists like Ja Rule and 50 Cent, once his street rivals, now found themselves in Supreme's orbit, their careers intertwined with his newfound legitimacy. Supreme was like a kingmaker, said the former associate. He could make or break artists. If you were in his good graces, your career would skyrocket. But if you crossed him, well, you'd better watch your back. This delicate balance of power within the music industry was a far cry from the brutality that had defined Supreme's rise in the drug trade. Yet, his penchant for violence and intimidation never truly left him. Whispers of his involvement in various incidents threatened to undermine his carefully cultivated image of respectability. As Supreme's influence in the music world grew, so did scrutiny from law enforcement. Investigators began piecing together the connections between the former drug kingpin and Murder Inc.'s activities, leading to high-profile raids and investigations that threatened to unravel Supreme's carefully constructed empire. Supreme thought he could just transition from the streets to the boardroom and no one would be the wiser. The former employee lamented, but he underestimated the law's reach and the intensity of the spotlight that comes with being a major player in the music industry. The tension between Supreme's criminal past and his newfound status as a music industry power broker was a constant source of conflict, testing his ability to navigate the treacherous waters of both worlds. As the stakes grew higher and pressure mounted, it became clear that Supreme's quest for legitimacy and influence would ultimately collide with the demons of his past. Chapter 5 concludes with Supreme's return to the criminal activities that had once defined his reign, setting the stage for the final, dramatic chapter in the rise and fall of the man known as Supreme. Chapter 6: The Last Dance. As the 1990s drew to a close, the once towering Supreme team was in a state of disarray. The crack cocaine epidemic that had fueled their rise had begun to wane, and the streets of Queens were no longer as lucrative as they had once been. Supreme, having spent nearly a decade behind bars, returned to a changed landscape where his former criminal dominance was no longer assured. Determined to reclaim his power and influence, Supreme made the fateful decision to return to his old ways. This time, however, his ambitions would extend beyond the streets and into the heart of the music industry he had already infiltrated through his partnership with Murder Inc.'s Records. The murder of E-Money Bags, a rival drug dealer, would prove to be the catalyst that would ultimately unravel Supreme's carefully constructed empire. The investigation into this high-profile killing would expose the deep-rooted connections between Supreme's criminal enterprises and the artists and executives of the music industry he had sought to legitimize. As the noose tightened around him, Supreme found himself embroiled in a complex web of tensions and betrayals. Both on the streets and within the music world, he had come to dominate. His attempts to maintain control and silence those who threatened to expose his misdeeds would only serve to hasten his downfall. Supreme's return to Queens was marked by a renewed sense of determination. He had spent nearly a decade behind bars, watching as the landscape of the city he once dominated had shifted beneath his feet. The crack cocaine epidemic that had fueled the Supreme team's rise had begun to wane, and the streets were no longer as lucrative as they had once been. Undeterred, Supreme set out to reclaim his former power and influence. This time, however, his ambitions would extend beyond the streets and into the heart of the music industry he had already infiltrated through his partnership with Murder Inc. Records. Supreme knew that the streets alone were no longer enough, recalled Irv Gotti, the co-founder of Murder Inc. He had to find a way to legitimize his influence, and the music industry was the perfect avenue for that. Supreme's relationship with Gotti and the artists under the Murder Inc. umbrella, such as Ja Rule and 50 Cent, had already blurred the lines between crime and entertainment. But as Supreme's return to the drug trade became increasingly brazen, the tension within this uneasy alliance began to escalate. The murder of E-Money Bags, a rival drug dealer, would prove to be the catalyst that would ultimately unravel Supreme's carefully constructed empire. The investigation into this high-profile killing would expose the deep-rooted connections between Supreme's criminal enterprises and the artists and executives of the music industry he had sought to legitimize. We knew Supreme was up to no good, but we didn't think he'd be so bold as to take out E-Money Bags right in our backyard, said a former member of the Supreme team, who spoke on the condition of anonymity. That was the beginning of the end for him. As the noose tightened around Supreme, he found himself embroiled in a complex web of tensions and betrayals, both on the streets and within the music world he had come to dominate. His attempts to silence those who threatened to expose his misdeeds would only serve to hasten his downfall. Witnesses to the E-Money Bags murder began to disappear, and the investigation stalled. However, the authorities were not deterred, and they soon turned their attention to Supreme's connections within the music industry. Subpoenas were issued, and records were seized, as the line between crime and entertainment became increasingly blurred. "It was a mess, man," recalled a former associate of Supreme's. Supreme was trying to play both sides, but the more he tried to cover his tracks, the more he ended up exposing himself. He was in way over his head. As the pressure mounted, Supreme's attempts to maintain control became increasingly desperate. He lashed out at those he perceived as threats, both within his own organization and within the music industry. The violence that had once been his calling card now threatened to consume him entirely. The chapter culminates with Supreme's ultimate downfall, as the weight of his criminal actions and the complex web of connections he had woven finally caught up with him. The narrative paints a vivid picture of a man whose pursuit of power and influence led him down a path of no return, leaving a legacy that would forever be intertwined with the gritty streets of Queens and the seductive world of hip-hop. Chapter 7: Legacy of a Supreme. As dusk settled over South Jamaica, Queens, a pall of solemnity blanketed the neighborhood. News had spread like wildfire. Kenneth Supreme McGriff, the once feared kingpin of the Supreme team, had been sentenced to life in prison without parole. The man who'd once ruled the streets and infiltrated the music industry's upper echelons had finally fallen, a victim of his own ambition and law enforcement's relentless pursuit. In the aftermath of Supreme's arrest and conviction, the community grappled with his complex legacy. To some, he was a ruthless criminal whose reign of terror had shattered countless lives. To others, he was a product of a system that had failed them, a man who'd seized power when legitimate opportunities were scarce. And to a select few, he remained larger than life, embodying the blurred lines between crime and culture. Supreme was undeniably a legend, said Irv Gotti, co-founder of Murder Inc. Records and Supreme's former business partner, but he was also a cautionary tale. He showed us how the pursuit of power and wealth can corrupt even the most talented individuals. Gotti's words resonated with many in the hip-hop community who'd witnessed Supreme's influence firsthand. The Supreme team's deep pockets had fueled the rise of numerous artists, providing the financial backing to break into the industry. Yet that patronage came at a steep price, blurring the lines between legitimate business and criminal enterprise. Supreme was the kingpin, but he had his fingers in many pies, explained Ja Rule, the multi-platinum rapper closely associated with Murder, Inc. He had the street cred, the connections, and the money to make things happen. But in the end, it all crumbled because he couldn't let go of that criminal lifestyle. The collapse of Supreme and Murder, Inc. sent shockwaves through the music industry, prompting many to question the extent of organized crime's infiltration into entertainment. Revelations of Supreme's involvement in E-Moneybags murder and alleged connections to other high-profile crimes tarnished the entire label's reputation, leading to its eventual demise. It was a wake-up call for the industry, said 50 Cent, Supreme's longtime rival and a key figure in Murder, Inc.'s downfall. We all knew the streets and music were intertwined, but Supreme took it to another level. He showed us just how dangerous that relationship could be. As the community reeled from Supreme's downfall, many sought to understand the deeper societal factors that had given rise to such a figure. The crack cocaine epidemic of the 80s and 90s had ravaged neighborhoods like South Jamaica, leaving a legacy of poverty, violence, and shattered dreams. In the absence of legitimate economic opportunities, young men like Supreme turned to the drug trade as a means of survival and a path to power. Supreme was a product of his environment, said Dr. Jamal Harrison, a sociologist who'd studied the crack epidemic's impact on urban communities. He grew up in a world where the streets were the only way to get ahead, and once he tasted that kind of power and wealth, letting go became impossible. Kenneth Supreme McGriff's story had become a cautionary tale, a stark reminder of the consequences when crime and culture collide. His influence stretched far beyond Queens, shaping the very fabric of the music industry and urban landscape. But ultimately, his pursuit of power led him down a path of no return, culminating in a life sentence that left many questioning the nature of justice and the complexities of the human experience. As night fell on South Jamaica, the streets whispered tales of a fallen empire. Kenneth Supreme McGriff's legacy lingered in the air, a complex tapestry of ambition, power, and ultimately, downfall. His story, woven into the very fabric of hip-hop and urban culture, serves as a stark reminder of the thin line between success and ruin. Whether viewed as a villain or a product of his environment, Supreme's impact on an entire generation is undeniable. His journey from the streets to the pinnacle of the music industry and back to a life behind bars offers a powerful lesson on the consequences of unchecked ambition and the allure of power. As we conclude this gripping saga, we invite you to reflect on the broader implications of Supreme's story. What does it tell us about the American dream, the music industry, and the communities often left behind? Your thoughts and perspectives are valuable to this ongoing conversation. If you've found this story as captivating as we have, we encourage you to take action. Subscribe to our channel for more in-depth stories that explore the intersection of crime, culture, and society. Like this video to show your appreciation for our storytelling. Comment below with your thoughts on Supreme's legacy and its relevance today. Share this video with friends and family to spark meaningful discussions about power, ambition, and redemption. Remember, by engaging with these stories, we not only honor the complex narratives of our past, but also shape the conversations that will define our future. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the rise and fall of the Supreme Team.